One dangerous human ship crossed their border. Every alien fleet began retreating. The border station of Karvos Reach had not seen a real alarm in 11 years. It sat at the edge of the Karathi Assembly's claimed space, a ring of gray metal turning slowly against a backdrop of dim stars, watching over a stretch of empty void that separated the assembly from the territory of a species most of its young officers had only read about in old files. That night, the silence broke. A junior sensor officer named Pel Adaru was the one who saw it first. She was young for her post, barely 3 years out of the officer academy on Korath Prime, and she still felt a small thrill every time a new contact blinked onto her screen, even though most contacts turned out to be drifting rock or old comm satellites. This one was different. It did not drift. It moved with purpose, a single clean line cutting across the dark, coming from the direction of human space and heading straight for the border. She checked the numbers twice before she called it in. "One contact," she said into the comm, trying to keep her voice level. "Mass and drive signature match a human warship class. Confirmed hull profile. It is alone." For a moment, nobody answered her. Then the duty commander, an older Karathi named Senik Dral, walked over to her station without hurrying, the way officers walk when they do not yet believe something is real. He looked at the screen for a long moment. His 4 eyes narrowed, all at once, in a way that made younger officers uncomfortable. "Confirm it again," he said quietly. She confirmed it again. The signature did not change. One ship, unescorted. No fleet behind it, no support carriers, no listening drones running ahead of it to scout the way. Just one ship, moving steadily toward the borderline, as if it owned the space it was crossing. Senik Dral stood very still for a few seconds, and then he did something that confused Pel more than the contact itself. He did not raise the alarm. He did not call for interceptors. He reached over her shoulder, tapped a code into the console, and sent a single priority message up the chain of command, marked with a designation Pel had never seen used in her career. Directive 0. "Sir," she said carefully, "shouldn't we scramble a response wing? It's just one ship. We could intercept it easily before it reaches the inner buffer zone." Senik Dral turned to look at her, and for the first time that night, she saw something in his face that unsettled her far more than any alarm would have. It was not fear exactly. It was the calm, old kind of caution that comes from knowing a story that younger people have never been told in full. "No," he said. "We do not intercept a lone human warship. We pull back. Everyone pulls back. That is the order, and it has been the order since before you were born." Pel frowned. "Pulls back from one ship?" "From one human ship," Senik Dral said, and there was something almost like respect buried under the caution in his voice. "Those are not the same thing." Within 20 minutes, every vessel assigned to Karvos Reach began to move. Patrol cutters that had been running lazy loops along the border turned and increased distance. The 2 light cruisers stationed near the outer marker pulled back toward the station itself. Even the automated defense platforms, usually left running on their standard aggressive posture, were switched by hand to passive monitoring only. Nothing pointed a weapon at the approaching ship, nothing challenged it. The entire sector, in the space of half an hour, rearranged itself around the presence of a single vessel, the way a school of small fish rearranges itself around a shape in the water that it has learned, generation after generation, to fear. Pel watched all of this happen from her station, and the strangeness of it kept building in her chest until she could not hold the question in any longer. "Sir," she said, "I don't understand. We have 3 warships and 2 platforms in this sector. That ship is one hull. Even if it's fast, even if it's armed well, we could still..." "Could we?" Senik Dral said. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked the question and let it sit there. "Do you know why the order is called Directive 0, Officer Adaru?" She shook her head. "Because it comes before every other directive," he said. "Before combat doctrine, before border enforcement rules, before anything else in the command manual. It was the very first standing order, written into Assembly Defense Policy after the Verith incident, and it has never been revised, because nobody in 40 years has found a reason to revise it. Whenever a single, unescorted human warship crosses into contested or assembly space without declared hostile intent, every fleet element in the area withdraws to a minimum safe distance and observes. No exceptions, no matter how small the ship looks on our sensors. Because we're afraid one ship could beat 3 of ours? Because we know what happens when a human ship is cornered, Senec Dral said, and this time his voice dropped lower, the way voices drop when people are talking about something they would rather not have to explain. It is not about whether we could win a fight against that ship today. It is about what that fight would cost, and what it would become, and whether anyone would want to live through what came after. Pell did not fully understand, not yet, but she understood enough to stop arguing. She watched the human ship continue its course on her screen, a small green marker moving steadily through empty space, that had, just minutes before, belonged entirely to the Karathi assembly. Far across the sector, in a war room built into the heart of a moon-sized command station called Ashfall Height, the news reached higher authority within the hour. Grand Marshal Thex Varanu, commander of the Assembly's 3rd Border Fleet, received the report while reviewing supply requisitions with 2 of his staff officers. He read it twice, set it down on the table, and was quiet for long enough that his aides exchanged a worried glance. "1 ship," he said finally. "Confirmed human, unescorted, crossing at Carvos Reach." "Yes, Grand Marshal," said his adjutant, a sharp young officer named Isvan Kaur. "Station Command has already initiated Directive 0. All sector assets are pulling to observation distance." Thex Varanu nodded slowly. He was an old officer, old enough to remember a time before Directive 0 existed, old enough to have been a young lieutenant on the day the order was first written, in the aftermath of an event that had changed the way 3/4 of the known galaxy thought about a species that, before that day, most had considered barely worth watching. "Do we have identification on the ship itself?" he asked. "Hull registry captain, point of origin?" Isvan Kaur checked the datapad in her hand. Registry marks it as a Sentinel-class vessel. Designation ISS Reckoning. Captain of record is listed as Daniel Reyes. Thex Varanu went very still. "Say that name again," he said. "Daniel Reyes, Grand Marshal." The old commander closed his eyes for a moment, and the 2 younger officers in the room watched him with growing unease, because they had both served under him long enough to know that Grand Marshal Thex Varanu did not often show anything close to worry on his face, and he was showing it now. "Reyes," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Of course it would be Reyes." "Sir, is that name significant?" Isvan Kaur asked. "I don't have a file on him." "You wouldn't," Thex Varanu said. "Human personnel records are not something we get freely, and the ones we do have are old. But I know the name because I know the family. Daniel Reyes is the grandson of Admiral Elena Reyes." He paused, watching to see if the name meant anything to his younger officers. It did not. Neither of them had been born yet when it mattered. "You should both go and read the full Varith incident file tonight," he said. "Not the summary, the full file. I want you to understand exactly what kind of ship just crossed our border, and exactly what kind of captain is standing on its bridge, before you say another word to me about intercepting it." The 2 officers exchanged another glance, but neither of them argued. There was something in the Grand Marshal's tone that made arguing feel like a very bad idea. Meanwhile, far ahead of any Karathi sensor net, aboard the ISS Reckoning, life continued in a way that would have surprised anyone watching the chaos it was causing behind it. The ship's bridge was quiet, lit in the soft blue-white glow that human vessels favored, and Captain Daniel Reyes sat in his command chair, with a mug of what passed for coffee out on long deployments, reading through a status report, with the mild, unhurried attention of a man checking the weather. He was not a large man, not the kind of towering, broad-shouldered figure that popular fiction sometimes imagined human captains to be. He was of average height, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that looked tired, in the way faces look tired after decades of service, rather than after one bad night. He had a calm about him that his crew had learned, over years of serving with him, was not the calm of a man who did not understand danger, but the calm of a man who had faced enough of it to know exactly how much of it was worth worrying about. "Border crossing complete," said his helm officer, a young lieutenant named Priya Nandan. "We are officially inside contested space. No challenge from local defense forces. Sensors show them pulling back on all headings." "Good," Reyes said, not looking up from his report. "Captain, with respect," Priya said, "should that be good? We just crossed into hostile territory, and every ship in range ran away from us. That's not exactly normal." Reyes finally looked up, and there was the faintest trace of a tired smile on his face. "It's normal for us," he said. "Might not feel normal, but it's how it usually goes out here. They know the flag on our hull. They know what happened the last time somebody tried to corner one of our ships in this region, and none of them want to be the one who finds out if the stories were exaggerated." "Were they?" Priya asked. "Exaggerated, I mean." Reyes set his report down and looked at his young lieutenant for a moment, thinking about how to answer that. He had grown up hearing the story of Verith from his own family, not as legend but as memory, passed down through people who had lived it, or who had lost someone in it. To him it was not a myth used to scare aliens into retreating. It was a scar that his family, and his species, still carried. "No," he said finally. "They weren't exaggerated. If anything, most versions the Karathi tell each other are softer than what actually happened. We don't correct them. Doesn't help anyone to relive it in more detail than they already do." Priya nodded slowly, filing that away, and turned back to her console. The reckoning continued on its course, deeper into contested space, alone and unescorted, exactly as its orders required. Its mission was not, in fact, a warlike one. Somewhere ahead, at a small research and trade outpost called Thessa Station, a group of human scientists, engineers, and their families had been stranded for nearly 3 weeks after a local political dispute cut off their supply lines and left them dependent on aid that a fractured local government could not agree to send. The reckoning had been dispatched, alone, to retrieve them, because a single ship moving quickly and quietly was, according to the logic of human command doctrine, far less likely to provoke an incident than a large fleet moving slowly and loudly. It was, in its own way, a peaceful mission. But peaceful missions, when carried out by a species with a reputation like humanity's, did not always look peaceful from the outside. As the reckoning advanced, sector by sector, fleet after fleet, quietly turned and withdrew ahead of it, clearing a corridor of empty space that no one had ordered cleared in any formal, public way. It was simply understood. It was simply what happened whenever a human ship crossed the line alone. Behind that quiet retreat, though, not everyone agreed with the wisdom of it. In a smaller command post near the edge of the same sector, a young and ambitious Karathi officer named General Vrask Ithani watched the reports scroll across his own screen with a very different expression than the caution shown by his elders. Where Thex Varanu saw history and warning, Vrask saw an insult. He watched fleet after fleet retreat from a single unescorted vessel, and something in him, something proud and impatient and hungry for a name of his own, began to burn. "One ship," he said to his second-in-command, a Karathi officer named Bressa who had served with him for nearly a decade. "One ship, and half our sector command is running like frightened children. Do you understand how that looks, Bressa? Do you understand what it teaches every species watching our border? It teaches them that the Karathi assembly can be pushed around by a single warship and a story 40 years old." "The order comes from the Grand Marshal himself," Bressa said carefully. "Directive Zero is not a suggestion, General. It is written into fleet doctrine. Doctrine written by old men who were young enough to be frightened once, and have never stopped being frightened since," Vrask said. "I am not one of them. And I do not intend to let one human captain walk through our territory like he owns it, simply because 40 years ago some other human captain made a very expensive point about how far his people are willing to go." Bressa said nothing, but the look on his face made it clear he did not share his commander's confidence. Vrask ignored it. He turned back to his console, began quietly pulling together status reports on the ships under his direct authority, ships technically stationed near the border for routine patrol duties, ships that were not, strictly speaking, under Thex Varanu's direct tactical control in the moment. He did not intend to disobey Directive Zero openly, not yet. But he began, that night, to plan a way around it, convinced that the fear driving the entire sector's retreat was an old story, with no teeth left in it, a ghost that had frightened a generation into cowardice, and would frighten no one else if someone was brave enough to finally stand and prove it wrong. Far ahead, unaware of the ambition quietly gathering behind him, the ISS Reckoning continued deeper into contested space, its crew calm, its mission simple, its presence alone enough to reshape the movements of an entire alien fleet without a single shot being fired. The border had been crossed, the retreat had begun, and somewhere in the space between an old fear and a young officer's pride, The first threads of a much larger confrontation were quietly starting to pull taut. To understand why an entire border sector emptied itself in front of one human ship, it helps to go back 40 years, to a system called Vareth, and to a day that changed how a large part of the galaxy thought about humanity forever. At the time, humanity was still new to the wider community of spacefaring species. Earth had only recently developed reliable faster-than-light travel, and human colonies were young, scattered, and thinly defended. Many of the older, more established powers in the region, including the Korathi Assembly, viewed the arrival of humans with a mixture of curiosity and mild dismissal. Humans were seen as clever but fragile, resourceful but small, a species worth watching, but not worth taking seriously, as any kind of threat. That view did not last. The Vareth system held one of humanity's earliest deep space colonies, a modest settlement of just under 200,000 people, living on a rocky moon that had been terraformed slowly over 2 decades of patient work. It was not a wealthy colony, and it was not a military one. It existed mostly as a mining and research outpost, home to families who had left Earth looking for a quieter life among the stars. The Korathi Assembly, in those days, was in the middle of a long and difficult territorial dispute with a neighboring alien coalition, and Vareth sat inside a stretch of space that both sides believed, for different reasons, belonged to them. When a Korathi survey fleet arrived at Vareth to formally claim the system, they found it already settled, already populated, already home to a small human colonial government that had no intention of leaving. What followed was not, at first, meant to be a massacre. The Korathi commander at the time, a competent but rigid officer named Fleet Marshal Dasik Orenu, issued a formal demand. The human colonists were to evacuate the system within a set period, or accept relocation under Korathi supervision. From the Korathi point of view, this was standard procedure, the same process used dozens of times before against smaller, weaker species who lacked the strength to resist a determined fleet. The human colonial government refused. They did not refuse out of foolish pride. The colony's leadership understood perfectly well that they had no military force capable of matching the fleet gathering in their system. What they had instead was a single-armed escort vessel, the ISS Meridian, commanded by a young admiral named Elena Reyes, who had been assigned to Vareth on a routine patrol rotation, and found herself, through no plan of her own, standing between an entire alien battle fleet and 200,000 civilians with nowhere else to go. Admiral Reyes sent a message back to Fleet Marshal Dasik Orenu that would later be studied, quoted, and remembered across 2 different species for the next 40 years. She told him, plainly, that the colonists of Vareth were not going to be relocated, that she did not have the ships to stop his fleet by force, and that if his fleet moved to forcibly remove the population, she would not surrender her ship, her crew, or the colony, without a fight, regardless of the outcome. Fleet Marshal Dasik Orenu, confident in the overwhelming size of his force, gave the order to advance. What happened next was recorded by both sides, from different angles, and the records still exist today in assembly archives, studied carefully by every officer who reaches flag rank. The ISS Meridian, alone against a fleet more than 40 times its size, did not run. It positioned itself directly between the advancing Korathi ships and the colony's main population centers, and it fought. By any reasonable measure, the battle should have ended in minutes. The Meridian was outgunned beyond any hope of survival, and every officer on its bridge knew it. But Admiral Reyes did not fight to win in any conventional sense. She fought to make the cost of taking Vareth so unbearable that no one watching would ever consider it worth paying again. The Meridian's crew fought for 6 hours. They used every defensive system, every evasive maneuver, every trick their engineers could improvise on the fly, buying time, while colony defense militias, armed with little more than mining equipment and desperation, evacuated as many civilians as they could into deep shelter tunnels beneath the moon's surface. When the Meridian's weapons were finally exhausted and its hull was failing beyond any hope of repair, Admiral Reyes made the decision that would define the rest of human military doctrine for the next generation. She ordered her surviving crew to evacuate to the last working escape pods, and she stayed behind alone, and she overloaded the Meridian's reactor core in the middle of the closest concentration of Korathi warships, at the exact moment their formation had drawn in tight to finish the fight. The resulting explosion destroyed 11 Karathi warships outright and crippled 6 more beyond repair. It was, at the time, one of the single most devastating losses the Karathi Assembly had ever suffered in one engagement, caused not by a superior fleet, but by one ship, one crew, and one commander, who refused to let her people be taken, without paying a price so severe that it would echo for decades. Fleet Marshal Dasik Orenu, faced with the wreck of his own formation, and the grim realization of what a single, cornered human ship had just cost him, made the decision to withdraw entirely, rather than continue the assault on the colony itself. Vareth remained human territory. The story of what one small, doomed ship had done to defend it spread across Karathi command channels within days, and from there into every neighboring power that had contact with the Assembly. It was not simply the scale of the destruction that unsettled the wider galaxy. It was the message underneath it. Humanity, still a young and comparatively weak species by every conventional military measure, had shown, in the clearest possible terms, that they did not calculate the value of a fight by whether they could win it. They calculated it by whether the price of winning was worth paying, and they had proven, at Vareth, that they were willing to make that price catastrophic, even in certain defeat. In the years that followed, the Karathi Assembly quietly rewrote its border engagement doctrine. Directive Zero was born directly out of the lessons of Vareth. Never corner a human ship. Never assume a small human force is an easy target. Never mistake caution or restraint from a human commander for weakness, because the moment they decide a fight is worth the cost they are willing to pay has no reasonable ceiling. Aboard the ISS Reckoning, 40 years later, Captain Daniel Reyes carried that history with him, not as a legend, but as family memory. Admiral Elena Reyes had been his grandmother. He had grown up hearing about her not as a myth, but as a real person, remembered by his own father as a quiet, thoughtful woman who loved gardening and old music and hated being called a hero, because to her, and later to her family, Vareth had never felt like a triumph. It had felt like a terrible, necessary loss that she had never fully recovered from in the short time she had left to live before her own health failed her years later. Daniel Reyes had chosen a life in the fleet partly because of her, and partly in spite of the weight her name carried. He had spent much of his early career trying to prove himself as an officer in his own right, rather than simply as the grandson of the woman who had become a symbol. It had taken him years to make peace with the fact that wherever he served, in whatever ship, under whatever command, the name Reyes would open doors and close others, would earn him respect from those who understood its history, and quiet suspicion from those who assumed he was trading on a reputation he had not personally earned. He had earned it, in his own way, over 2 decades of service, through careful command decisions, through a reputation among his own crews for competence rather than recklessness, through a habit of making sure that every mission under his command that could be resolved without violence was resolved without violence. He was not a man who sought battles. He was a man who understood, intimately, what it cost when battles could not be avoided, and he carried that understanding with him every day he sat in the command chair. On the bridge of the Reckoning, hours after crossing the border, Lieutenant Priya Nandan found herself thinking about the story Reyes had confirmed, rather than denied earlier, turning it over in her mind as she monitored the ship's slow, steady progress deeper into contested space. "Captain," she said eventually, unable to fully let the subject go, "can I ask you something personal?" Reyes glanced over at her, mild curiosity on his tired face. "You can ask. Does it bother you? Carrying that name out here, where everyone who sees our ship's registry probably knows exactly whose family you come from?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly, rather than brushing it aside. "Sometimes," he admitted. "It's a strange thing, having a piece of history attached to your name that you didn't choose and can't put down. But mostly, no. Mostly I think about what she actually wanted, at the end of it. She never wanted to be famous for what she did at Vareth. She wanted the colony to survive. She wanted her crew to make it home. Most of them did, because she made sure of it before she made her final call. If people out here remember her name, and it keeps some other colony from being wiped off a star chart because a fleet commander decides we're not worth the trouble of fighting, then I think she'd have been able to live with that, even if she never wanted the attention herself." Priya nodded slowly, absorbing that. "And the ship's pulling back from us right now? Does that bother you? Knowing it's fear, not respect?" It's usually both, Reyes said. Fear and respect aren't as far apart as people like to think. I'd rather they respect us enough to be afraid of pushing us too far than not respect us at all and find out the hard way what happens when they do. Either way, nobody dies today because of it. That's the part that matters to me. The conversation drifted into quiet after that, the bridge settling back into its normal working rhythm. The reckoning continued its course, its long-range sensors picking up the steady pattern of Karathi vessels adjusting course around it, always keeping distance, always careful never to appear as a threat. Far behind the ship's position, General Vrask Ithani was not thinking about respect, and he was not thinking about the cost of a fight he had never personally witnessed. He had grown up on stories of Vareth, the way most young Karathi officers had, as a distant historical warning rather than a lived memory, softened by decades of retelling into something that felt more like an old campfire tale than a real and terrible loss. To him, the caution built into Directive Zero felt less like wisdom earned through hard experience and more like an outdated fear that had calcified into cowardice, one that a bold and capable commander could finally prove wrong if given the chance. He gathered 3 warships under his direct authority that night, technically assigned to routine patrol duties along a stretch of border adjacent to Karvos Reach, and he began quietly plotting a course that would bring them into position ahead of the Reckoning's projected path, far enough from Grand Marshal Thex Voranu's direct oversight that his movements could, for a time, be explained away as ordinary patrol activity. He told himself he was not planning to disobey Directive Zero outright. He told himself he was simply going to be in position, close enough to observe, close enough to react if the situation changed. It was a small, careful lie, the kind ambitious officers often tell themselves in the early stages of a decision they have already, in their heart, committed to making. Behind him, his second-in-command Bressa watched the course plotted on the display and felt a familiar, uneasy tightness settle into his chest, the particular unease of a man who has served long enough to recognize the early shape of a mistake before it has fully happened, and who does not yet know how to stop it from happening anyway. Grand Marshal Thex Voranu did not sleep well that night. He sat alone in his quarters, aboard Ashfall Height, long after his staff had gone to their rest cycles, reading through old files he had not opened in years, files from the Vareth incident that he kept, quietly, for moments exactly like this one, when a new generation of officers needed reminding of what history had already taught and paid for in full. He thought about Daniel Reyes, a name he had not expected to encounter directly in his own sector, and he thought about General Vrask Ithani, whose ambitions and frustrations were not exactly a secret among the senior command staff. Vrask was talented, there was no question of that. He had one of the best combat records among the Assembly's younger fleet commanders, sharp tactical instincts, a crew that respected him, and a habit of pushing right up against the edge of standing orders without technically breaking them. It was a habit that had, until now, mostly worked in his favor. Thex Voranu had a bad feeling it would not work in his favor tonight. He called Isvan Kaur into his office before the start of the next duty shift. "Pull the current positions of every patrol element assigned near Karvos Reach," he told her. "I want to know exactly where General Vrask's ships are right now, and I want to know before he has a chance to explain it to me himself." Isvan Kaur returned 20 minutes later, with a data pad and a carefully neutral expression that told Thex Voranu everything he needed to know before she said a word. "Grand Marshal," she said, "General Vrask has repositioned 3 vessels under his authority. Officially logged as an extended patrol rotation along the southern border approach. Unofficially," she paused, "their current heading places them almost directly in the projected path of the human vessel, assuming it maintains its current course toward Thessa Station." Thex Voranu closed his eyes briefly. "Get me a direct line to General Vrask, now." The connection took several minutes to establish, and when Vrask's image finally appeared on the office display, he looked exactly as composed and confident as Thex Voranu had expected, which did not make the conversation any easier. "Grand Marshal," Vrask said, inclining his head in a show of respect that did not quite reach his eyes, "I assume this is about my patrol rotation." "It is exactly about your patrol rotation," Thex Voranu said. "Explain to me why 3 of your ships are moving into a position that places them in the direct path of a vessel currently operating under Directive Zero protection." "With respect, Grand Marshal, my ships are conducting a routine southern border patrol, well within the standard parameters of my authority. If our patrol path happens to intersect with the general direction the human vessel is traveling, that is a matter of shared space, not intentional interception. Do not insult me with that answer, Thexvoranu said, his voice sharpening for the first time in the conversation. I have read your service record. I know exactly how good a tactician you are, and a good tactician does not accidentally place 3 warships along the projected path of a Directive Zero vessel. You know precisely what you are doing. Vrask's composed expression flickered, just slightly, before settling back into place. Then let me speak plainly, Grand Marshal, if you'll permit it. Speak. I do not believe Directive Zero serves this assembly well any longer, Vrask said. I understand the history behind it. I have read the Verith file, more than once. But that was 40 years ago, against a fleet commander who badly underestimated his opponent and paid a terrible price for it. We are not that fleet commander. My ships are not caught by surprise, undersupported, and unprepared for what we might face. I am proposing nothing reckless. I am simply proposing that my patrol maintain its position, close enough to observe the human vessel directly, and demonstrate to every species watching our border that the Karathi assembly does not scatter in fear every time a single foreign ship crosses our territory. You are proposing to test 40 years of hard-won caution on your own personal judgment, Thexvoranu said. That is what you are proposing, General, whatever language you choose to dress it in. With respect, Grand Marshal, someone eventually has to. Otherwise, we remain frightened of a single human warship indefinitely, on the strength of one battle fought a lifetime ago, against a fleet that is no longer even representative of our current strength or doctrine. Thexvoranu studied the younger officer's face for a long moment, weighing his options. He could order Vrask to stand down immediately, formally, on the record, and if Vrask refused, escalate the matter into a direct command dispute that would take precious hours to resolve through proper channels, while the reckoning continued its course, unaware and unbothered, straight toward whatever waited for it. I am ordering you, formally, to withdraw your patrol to standard observation distance, in full compliance with Directive Zero, Thexvoranu said. I am not asking for your opinion on the wisdom of the order, General. I am giving you a direct command. Understood, Grand Marshal, Vrask said, and there was something in the careful, even tone of his voice that made Thexvoranu deeply uneasy, though he could not, in the moment, put his finger on exactly why. The connection ended. Thexvoranu sat alone in his office for a long moment afterward, staring at the star chart displayed across his wall, watching the small marker representing the ISS Reckoning continue its slow, steady path through contested space, and the 3 markers representing Vrask's patrol group, which had not, he noted with growing unease, actually changed course. Isvan, he said quietly, keep a close watch on General Vrask's fleet. I do not trust that he intends to follow the order he just gave me. Yes, Grand Marshal, Isvan Kaur said, already moving to comply. Aboard the ISS Reckoning, the mood remained calm and unhurried, entirely unaware of the tension building behind it along the border. Captain Reyes spent the better part of the day working through routine ship business, reviewing supply projections for the return trip with the stranded colonists from Thessa Station, checking in with his engineering chief about a minor coolant fluctuation in one of the secondary systems, and taking a short meal in the ship's mess hall with several members of his crew, where conversation drifted, as it often did on long deployments, toward home. You really think the Thessa families are going to be all right when we get there? Asked one of the younger crew members, a systems technician named Owen Marsh. 3 weeks, stuck on a cut-off trade outpost with a local government that can't agree on sending aid. That sounds rough. They'll be scared, and tired, and probably angry at everyone involved in the mess that stranded them, Reyes said, taking a bite of his meal before continuing. But they'll be alive, and in a few days, they'll be back on a ship headed toward safer space. That's what matters most. The rest we can sort out once everyone's off that station and somewhere secure. Do you think the local government will try to stop us from taking them? Owen asked. I doubt it, Reyes said. Most local factions out here know exactly what it means when a single human ship shows up requesting a peaceful extraction. They know it's in everyone's interest to let it happen quietly and without incident. It's usually the ones who don't know that history who cause problems. He said it lightly, almost as an offhand comment, But there was a small, quiet part of him, built from decades of command experience, that filed the thought away and did not entirely let it go. He had learned, over the years, that it was always the officers who had not personally lived through history's hard lessons who were the most likely to test them. By the time the Reckoning sensors detected the first faint hints of unusual activity along its projected course, several hours later, that quiet instinct had already sharpened into something closer to alertness. "Captain," said the ship's tactical officer, a sharp, careful woman named Commander Fatima Idris, "long-range sensors are picking up 3 Korathi vessels, holding position roughly 2 hours ahead of our current course, just inside the edge of our projected path. Configuration matches light cruiser class. They're not broadcasting hostile intent, but they're also not repositioning the way the rest of the sector's assets have." Reyes set down the datapad he had been reviewing and walked over to the tactical display, studying the 3 markers Idris had highlighted. "Any identification on the commanding officer?" "Working on it now," Idris said. A moment later, the ship's computer pulled a partial match from intercepted communication traffic. "Best match is a Korathi officer, designated General Vraskithani. Service record shows a strong combat history, several notable engagements along the southern frontier, reputation among assembly command circles as ambitious and highly capable. And he's holding position directly ahead of us, instead of withdrawing like every other element in this sector has," Reyes said, more to himself than to anyone in particular. "That's correct, Captain." Reyes was quiet for a moment, thinking it through carefully. He had commanded enough missions along contested borders to know the difference between simple caution and a deliberate provocation, and the pattern in front of him was starting to look less like the former and more like the latter. "Options?" he asked, turning to his senior staff gathered on the bridge. "We could alter course," suggested Priya Nandan. "Add several hours to the trip, but avoid direct contact with his patrol entirely." "We could also hold our current course and speed," Idris said. "If he's testing the waters, changing our path now sends a signal that we can be pushed around by a show of force alone. That might invite more of the same later, from him or from someone watching how we respond." Reyes considered both options carefully, weighing the safety of his crew against the larger consequences of how the encounter might be read, not just by Vrask, but by every fleet commander watching the outcome unfold across the region's communication networks. "We hold course," he said finally. "We don't provoke, we don't threaten, and we don't run. If General Vrask wants to have his ship sit 2 hours ahead of us and watch us pass by peacefully, that's his choice to make, and it costs us nothing to let him make it. But I want full readiness across every system, effective immediately. If this turns into something more than watching, I want us ready for it before it happens, not after." "Understood, Captain," Idris said, already moving to relay the order. The Reckoning's crew settled into a quiet, professional readiness, the easy rhythm of the ship's daily routine, sharpening into something more focused, more alert, without ever tipping into open alarm. Reyes remained on the bridge, watching the 3 markers ahead of them on the display, thinking about the careful, deliberate distance Vrask's ships were holding, and about the particular kind of officer who chose to place himself directly in the path of a legend, rather than quietly stepping aside from it. He did not know, in that moment, exactly what General Vrask intended, but he had commanded long enough to recognize the shape of a decision that had already been made, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself, and he made sure, as the Reckoning continued forward at a steady, unhurried pace, that his ship and his crew were ready for whatever that moment turned out to be. The Reckoning closed the distance steadily, hour by hour, and the 3 Korathi cruisers under General Vrask's command held their position, waiting. On the bridge of his flagship, the Ashen Talon, Vrask watched the approaching human vessel on his own tactical display, with a mixture of anticipation and something close to satisfaction. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. "They haven't altered course," Bressa noted, standing at his side. "Not even slightly. They're going to pass directly through our position." "Of course they are," Vrask said. "That's exactly what I expected." "That's the whole point, Bressa. They don't alter course for anyone, because they've never had to. Their reputation has done all the work for them for 40 years. Today, that changes." "General," Bressa said carefully, "with respect, holding position and observing is one thing. If your intention is to escalate beyond observation, I need to remind you that we are still bound by direct orders from the Grand Marshal to maintain Directive Zero protocols. I have no intention of firing first, Vrask said. I intend to hold position, directly in their path, close enough that they cannot simply pass by us, as though we don't exist. I intend to make them choose. Either they alter course around us like every frightened patrol before us has expected them to demand, proving that even the mighty reckoning respects a show of Karathi resolve, or they hold their own course and pass close enough that we can demonstrate, clearly, for every officer watching this exchange across the sector, that we are not afraid to stand our ground in our own territory. And if they don't alter course, and don't back down, and simply continue forward as planned, then we will see exactly how confident Captain Daniel Reyes really is, when 3 Karathi warships are close enough to remind him that legends can still bleed. Bressa said nothing further, but the tightness in his chest had not eased since the night before, and it did not ease now. Aboard the Reckoning, Captain Reyes watched the same closing distance unfold on his own display, and as the range dropped below what any reasonable interpretation could call simple observation, his expression grew steadily more serious. They're not moving, Captain, Idris reported, holding formation directly across our projected path. At current closing speed, we'll be within their effective weapons range in approximately 11 minutes. Hail them, Reyes said. Formal, calm, no provocation. Let's see what General Vrask actually wants to say for himself. The channel opened a moment later, and Vrask's image appeared on the Reckoning's main display, composed and confident, exactly as he had been in his earlier conversation with Thex Varanu. Captain Reyes, Vrask said, I am General Vraskithani, of the Karathi Assembly 3rd Border Fleet. You are approaching a position held by my patrol group. I would ask that you alter course to maintain safe separation. General, Reyes said evenly, my ship is on a peaceful transit course through contested space, operating under Standard Directive Zero protocol, which, as I understand it, your own command doctrine established specifically to avoid exactly this kind of close encounter. I'm happy to maintain safe separation, but I'd point out that we were already on a course that avoided your position entirely, until your patrol moved to intercept us several hours ago. Vrask's expression tightened slightly. My patrol is conducting routine operations within our own territory, Captain. I would suggest you show appropriate caution, given the numbers currently arrayed against your single vessel. With respect, General, Reyes said, his voice remaining calm and unhurried. I'm well aware of the numbers. I'd ask you to consider, carefully, whether this is truly the encounter you want to have, before either of us commits to something neither of us can walk back afterward. There was a long pause on the other end of the channel. For a moment, Bressa allowed himself to hope that his commander might actually reconsider. But the pause ended, and Vrask's voice returned, harder than before. I have made my position clear, Captain. I would suggest you alter course. And I've made mine clear as well, General, Reyes said. We're holding our current heading. If you'd like to let us pass peacefully, we have no interest in anything beyond that. If you'd like to escalate this further, understand that the choice, and everything that follows from it, will be entirely yours. The channel closed. On the Ashen Talons Bridge, Vrask stared at the now blank display for a long moment, his pride warring visibly with the small, cold seed of doubt that Reyes's calm refusal to yield had planted somewhere in the back of his mind. He pushed the doubt aside. Bring weapons to standby readiness, he ordered. We will not fire first. But if that ship crosses into effective range and continues to hold its course without so much as a token adjustment, I want every system ready to respond the instant it becomes necessary. Aboard the Reckoning, similar orders were already being carried out, though with a very different tone behind them. All defensive systems to full readiness, Reyes ordered. Weapons hold, unless we are fired upon directly. I want shields at maximum efficiency, and I want engineering ready to reroute power on my mark, if we need every available system responding at once. Understood, Captain, Idris said, already relaying the orders through the ship. The Reckoning continued forward, steady and unhurried, closing the distance toward the 3 waiting Karathi cruisers. The tension on the bridge sharpened with every passing minute, though Reyes himself remained outwardly calm, watching the closing range with the same careful attention he might have given to any routine navigational hazard, rather than 3 warships prepared, if pushed, to open fire. The moment came when the reckoning crossed into effective weapons range of Vrask's formation, still holding its original course, still making no move to alter direction or slow its advance. On the Ashen Talons bridge, Vrask watched the human ship approach without deviation, and something in him, some final combination of pride and frustration and the desperate need to prove the old fear wrong, pushed him past the edge he had told himself, hours before, that he would not cross. "Fire a warning shot," he ordered, "wide of their hull. Let them understand exactly how close they are standing to the edge." Bressa hesitated for the briefest moment before relaying the order, and the Ashen Talon's forward weapons array fired a single, powerful energy bolt that streaked past the Reckoning's bow, close enough to register clearly on every sensor aboard, far enough to avoid direct contact. On the Reckoning's bridge, the shot registered instantly, and for 1/10 second, the entire crew held their breath, waiting for their captain's response. Reyes did not raise his voice. He did not order retaliation. He simply looked at the tactical display, watched the trajectory of the shot that had just crossed his ship's bow, and made his decision with the same steady calm he had carried since the moment the Reckoning first crossed the border. "Hold weapons," he said. "Do not return fire. Helm, maintain current course and speed." "Captain," Idris said, "they just fired on us." "They fired near us," Reyes corrected, deliberately wide. "That's not an attack, Commander. That's a message, and a nervous one at that. If we return fire now, we turn a warning shot into a real battle, and every ounce of restraint either side has shown up to this point goes out the window. We hold. We stay the course. We let General Vrask decide, one more time, exactly how far he actually wants to take this." Aboard the Ashen Talon, the sight of the Reckoning continuing forward, entirely unshaken, weapons still holding despite the warning shot, sent a ripple of unease through the bridge crew that Vrask could feel even without seeing it directly on anyone's face. He had expected, on some level, that the shot would provoke a response, either evasive or retaliatory, something that would confirm the danger everyone had warned him about, or something that would prove, definitively, that the danger had been overstated all along. Instead, he got neither. He got a ship that simply continued forward, calm and unbothered, as though his warning shot had been little more than a passing curiosity. "They're not responding," Bressa said quietly. "Not evading, not retaliating. They're just continuing." "Fire again," Vrask said, his voice tightening with something that was no longer entirely confidence. "Closer this time. Make them understand we are serious." Bressa hesitated, and this time the hesitation was long enough that Vrask turned to look at him directly. "General, I would urge extreme caution before." "I gave an order, Commander." Bressa relayed it, and a second shot streaked out from the Ashen Talon's weapons array, this time close enough to clip the very edge of the Reckoning's forward shields, sending a visible ripple of energy across the hull's protective field, close enough that the impact registered as a genuine, if minor, hit. That changed everything. Shields report a 2% efficiency loss on forward arrays, Idris reported immediately. "That was a direct hit, Captain, not a near miss." Reyes's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his posture shifted, the calm settling into a colder, harder kind of readiness. "Understood," he said. "Helm, reduce speed by half, and bring us to a full stop relative to their formation. Tactical. Target the Ashen Talon's weapons array directly, but hold fire until my command. Open a channel." The channel connected, and Vrask's image appeared once more, tense now in a way it had not been before. "General Vrask," Reyes said, his voice quieter than before, and somehow more unsettling for it. "You have now fired directly on a Directive Zero protected vessel, striking our shields. I am going to give you one opportunity, and only one, to stand your fleet down immediately and withdraw to safe distance. If you do that, right now, this ends here, with no further escalation, and no formal incident report beyond what's already occurred. If you choose not to, I want you to understand, clearly, that everything that happens after this point will be a direct consequence of your decision, not mine." Vrask stared back at him, his pride and his growing unease locked in a silent, visible struggle across his face. For a long moment, the bridge of the Ashen Talon held its breath, waiting to see which side of that struggle would win. General Vraskathani stood on the bridge of the Ashen Talon with every eye on him, waiting for a decision he had already, in some quiet corner of his mind, begun to regret setting in motion. Pride told him to hold his ground. The growing weight of what he had just done, firing directly on a ship protected by 40 years of hard-earned caution, told him something very different. "General," Bressa said quietly, close enough that only Vrask could hear him, "this is the moment. Whatever happens next, it will be remembered as your choice. Please, think of what that means, not just for us, but for everyone under your command." Vrask closed his eyes for a brief moment, the noise of the bridge fading around him, and when he opened them again, something in his posture had changed, the sharp edge of pride giving way, slowly, to something closer to clarity. "Stand down, weapons," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all day. "All ships, hold position, power down offensive systems, and prepare to withdraw on my mark." The order rippled through the Ashen Talon's crew, and a moment later, through the 2 other cruisers under his command. Weapons arrays powered down. Targeting locks disengaged. The tense, coiled readiness that had gripped all 3 ships for the past several minutes began, slowly, to ease. On the Reckoning's bridge, Idris watched the change register across her tactical display with visible relief. "Captain, they're standing down." All 3 vessels, weapons offline, beginning withdrawal maneuvers. Reyes allowed himself a small, quiet breath, the first real release of tension he had shown since the second shot struck their shields. "Good," he said. "Hold our position until they've cleared to a safe distance. No pursuit, no further contact, unless they initiate it." The channel to the Ashen Talon remained open, and Vrask's image lingered on the display a moment longer, his expression a complicated mixture of relief, shame, and something that might, given time, grow into genuine understanding. "Captain Reyes," he said, "I acted against direct orders from my Grand Marshal, and against my own better judgment, in pursuit of proving a point that I believed needed proving. I see now that the point I intended to make was never the one that actually mattered here." "General," Reyes said, his tone free of any triumph or mockery, "for what it's worth, I don't think you're the first officer to test old caution against new pride, and I doubt you'll be the last. What matters now is that you made the right call when it counted, before anyone on either side paid a price for the wrong one. That's not nothing. Take it for what it's worth, and carry it forward." The channel closed a moment later, and the 3 Karathi cruisers withdrew, slowly and without further incident, back toward the interior of assembly territory, their brief and dangerous test of Directive Zero, ending not in the catastrophe it had threatened to become, but in a quiet, sobering retreat that would, in its own way, teach a harder lesson than open conflict ever could have. Word of the encounter reached Grand Marshal Thex Voranu within the hour, relayed through Isvin Kor's careful, detailed report. He listened to the full account in silence, and when it was finished, he allowed himself a long, slow breath of relief that he had not realized he was holding. "He fired on them," Thex Voranu said quietly, "twice." "Yes, Grand Marshal, but Captain Reyes chose restraint at every stage, even after being struck directly. He gave General Vrask a clear opportunity to withdraw before any further escalation, and General Vrask ultimately took it." Thex Voranu shook his head slowly, thinking of the file he had reread the night before, of Admiral Elena Reyes, and the terrible price paid at Verith, and of how differently this encounter might have ended if her grandson had carried a different temperament into the same kind of moment. "Bring General Vrask before formal review the moment his ships return to assembly space," he said. "His actions today were a direct violation of standing orders, and they very nearly cost this sector a disaster we have spent 40 years trying to avoid repeating. But make sure the review reflects the full account, including the fact that he chose, in the end, to stand down rather than press the matter further. That choice deserves acknowledgement, even as the earlier ones deserve consequence." "Understood, Grand Marshal." Thex Voranu turned back toward the star chart on his wall, watching the marker representing the ISS Reckoning resume its steady course toward Thessa Station, undisturbed and unhindered by anything further along the way. He thought, not for the first time, about the strange and delicate balance his assembly had learned to maintain along its border with human space, a balance built not on open alliance or open hostility, but on a careful, mutual understanding of exactly how much each side was willing to risk, and exactly how much each side preferred not to find out. The Reckoning arrived at Thessa Station 2 days later, its passage through the remainder of contested space, calm and uneventful. Every fleet element it encountered along the way maintaining careful, respectful distance, in accordance with the standing order that had, once again, proven its worth. The stranded human colonists, scientists, engineers, and their families gathered at the station's small transit dock to greet the ship's arrival with a mixture of relief and quiet gratitude that Captain Reyes found, as always, more meaningful than any formal recognition his command might later receive. "We heard there was some trouble on the way here," said one of the colony's senior engineers, a weathered woman named Dr. Alicia Farrow, as she boarded the Reckoning alongside the first group of evacuees. "Word travels fast out here, even to a station as cut off as this one's been." "There was a moment of trouble," Reyes admitted. "It didn't turn into anything worse than that, and that's really all that matters." "Because of the ship's reputation?" Dr. Farrow asked. "Because of your family's name?" Reyes considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. "Because a young commander out there was smart enough, in the end, to choose restraint over pride, even after he'd already made a mistake. That's not about my family's name. That's about him making the right call when it counted. I'd rather people remember that part of it than the part where things almost went wrong." Dr. Farrow studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, seeming to understand something in his answer that went beyond the words themselves. "Well, however it happened, I'm glad you're the one who came for us. Thank you, Captain." "You're welcome," Reyes said simply. "Let's get everyone settled and get you all home." Over the following hours, the Reckoning's crew worked steadily to bring the last of the stranded colonists aboard, checking manifests, settling families into temporary quarters, and preparing the ship for its return journey. By the time the final evacuee had boarded and the Reckoning began its slow departure from Thessa Station, the mission that had begun with the crossing of a tense and heavily watched border had quietly, and without further incident, become exactly what it had always been intended to be: a peaceful rescue, carried out calmly and successfully by a single ship whose mere presence had been enough to keep an entire sector's worth of fleets from ever considering interference in the first place. News of the encounter with General Vrask's patrol spread quickly across the wider region in the days that followed, carried through official reports, informal fleet gossip, and the kind of quiet cross-border communication channels that no formal treaty ever fully manages to contain. Different versions of the story took shape as it traveled, some emphasizing the danger of the 2 shots fired against the Reckoning's shields, others emphasizing the calm, unshaken restraint Captain Reyes had shown throughout the entire encounter, choosing patience and clear warning over immediate retaliation, even after being struck directly. What emerged from all the retellings, more than any single detail of the encounter itself, was a reinforced and deepened version of the reputation that had first been forged 40 years earlier at Vareth. Humanity, it seemed, to every species now watching, was not simply dangerous because of the devastating things they were capable of when truly cornered. They were dangerous, and in a strange way deeply respected, because of the restraint they consistently chose to show before ever reaching that point, a restraint that made clear, again and again, that conflict with a human ship was never the outcome they sought, but always the outcome they were fully prepared to see through if given no other choice. Grand Marshal Thex Voranu reflected on this, weeks later, during a quiet moment in his office aboard Ashfall Height, reviewing the final formal report on the incident before filing it away into the Assembly's growing archive of border encounters. He thought about Directive Zero, about the caution it represented, and about how easily that caution could be mistaken, by younger and more ambitious officers, for simple fear rather than hard-won wisdom. He made a note, that day, to have the full story of Captain Daniel Reyes and the ISS Reckoning added to the standard training materials given to every young officer entering Border Command, not as another distant warning from the past, but as a living, recent example of exactly why the old caution still mattered, and exactly what could be gained by understanding it fully, rather than dismissing it as an outdated fear. Aboard the Reckoning, now making its steady way back toward human space with a full complement of relieved and grateful colonists settled safely in its quarters, Captain Daniel Reyes stood alone for a quiet moment near one of the ship's observation windows, watching the stars slide slowly past outside. He thought of his grandmother and of the terrible choice she had made at Vareth so many years before he was born, a choice that had shaped, in ways she could never have fully predicted, the entire tone of humanity's place among the stars. He thought too of General Vrask, and of the moment the young Korathi commander had chosen, at the very edge of disaster, to stand down, rather than press forward, into something neither of them could have walked back from. It was not a perfect resolution, not a clean or simple story of heroism and villainy, but it was, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of outcome he had spent his entire career trying to achieve. A dangerous moment, met with steady patience. A possible tragedy turned, through careful restraint on both sides, into nothing more than a hard lesson learned and carried forward. Behind him, Lieutenant Priya Nandan approached quietly, and stood beside him for a moment, watching the same slow drift of stars. "Do you think this changes anything, Captain?" she asked. "The story of what happened out here, added to everything people already believe about us?" Reyes considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Maybe a little," he said. "Maybe it reminds a few more people, on both sides of that border, that the story isn't really about how dangerous we can be. It's about how much we're willing to hold back, right up until the very last moment, because holding back is almost always the better choice, if the other side gives us room to make it. I'd rather be remembered for that than for anything my grandmother had to do at Vareth. She'd have wanted that too, I think." Priya nodded slowly, and the two of them stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars, as the ISS Reckoning carried its crew and its rescued passengers steadily onward, toward home, leaving behind it a border sector that would, for a long time to come, remember exactly what it meant when one dangerous human ship crossed the line, and every alien fleet in range quietly chose to step aside.